This is Sean at MADenomics, and today we are going to be looking at a term that you always hear on the news related to economy.
I'm sorry. I tried to find it for so long.
Okay, don't stop the recording. I am so keeping that.
Okay.
This is Sean at MADenomics, and today we are going to be looking at a term that you'll always hear at the news related to economy. It is the gross domestic product, or annual GDP. Chase, discuss it.
To define gross domestic product, it's the money value of all final goods and services produced within the year. And so we look at things like consumption, investment, government spending, net exports, and these kind of give us our total value of GDP. There's a few limitations, though. We don't look at things like secondhand goods, black markets, so if we have illicit substances, firearms, anything of that nature, it all goes untaxed and isn't included in our GDP as well. We do have unreported legal activities, under the table wages and that sort of thing. If you're working but not claiming tax on it, that's not included in our GDP. We have non-markets, so if I stay home and wash dishes, I'm doing work, but I don't actually get paid for it, and that would also include volunteer work. So going down to a food shelter and serving, you're doing it out of the goodness of your heart, and so you can't really tax that either.
The only thing that I will mention is tax is just the receipt.
So when we're looking at what causes a GDP to grow, it takes us back to our four elements of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. So the more we have, for example, Canadians consuming, it'll cause our growth to go up. If we have security in the market, more people are investing, it'll cause our GDP to grow up. If the government decides to spend a bunch of money, which we might save for another topic later on, the GDP will go up. Our net exports, which is our exports minus our imports, has an effect on our GDP as well. If we export more than we import, then more than likely our GDP is going to grow. We're able to see the effects of growth on our GDP, whether they be going down, whether they be going up at a certain time.
The value to this index, or a GDP index, tells us the direction a country is going. If the GDP increases from one year to the next, knowing that it is just a calculation of new products, new consumption, new investment, it means that a country is growing. It is spending more money. If the GDP was to decrease, it would say there was less new products, less new consumption in ratio to the previous year. It tells us that GDP is decreasing. This is why a concept of GDP per capita, which is essentially GDP divided by the population. This allows you to differentiate the growth of GDP in a country of United States or the GDP of a country of Portugal, because though United States GDP could increase by 5 million, a 5 million increase in Portugal would be substantially larger in comparison. So GDP per capita is the most valuable piece of information to look at in terms of growth. When we talk about increasing consumption, increasing investments, government spendings, and exports, why is it good?
It's good because it increases our GDP.
No, that's the shittiest answer ever, because no, we're defining why an increased GDP is good.
I don't know, I misheard what you said.
Why is increasing GDP good?
Having your GDP increase lets people have certain expectations for the future, and it provides a certain security. So if our GDP is increasing, and I know I'm going to make $30 an hour for the next 10 years, then I'm going to have the expectation that I'm actually able to spend more money, whether I be consuming, whether I be investing, whether I be importing goods from other countries. Having that expectation provides a certain amount of security in my spending. So, Sean, with this given information, what else could you include within expectation?
When you're talking about the increase in a GDP, this is the most important index we have to the value of one currency versus another currency. It is not all the information, but it is the buyer confidence. If your GDP is growing at a rate higher than another country, it will either increase or shrink the gap between the value of your dollar and the value of their dollar, or your currency and their currency. So the purpose of a country increasing the GDP is to increase the value of a country's currency. That is what is important about GDP from a personal or a consumer perspective. But another piece of information that is often portrayed in a poor light is the global domestic product in a ratio to a country's debt. This we can go into another day discussing what debt is. But since the global domestic product is the new production in that year, the debt is an amount of money that was taken out that year to create this new production. If you were to compare it to a small business, you take a loan of $100,000, and if you produce $150,000 of product, then your GDP to debt ratio is positive 50,000, a gain or a growth. When you look at countries' debt, you have to look at it in a comparison to the GDP. The only other factor that is unfortunately often misled during news cycles or information about countries' economic power is a concept called real GDP. If it is asked, I can produce the equation, but it is very simply the increase in production compensated by the increase in prices. For example, you might produce the exact same amount of apples from one year to the next, but since the market value of apples increased, it will artificially increase your GDP. Real GDP is an adjustment to find out accurate growth rates in production of goods and services. And that's all it is. So that's why we use GDP as an index. Though it's missing a bunch of information, as Chase pointed out previously, with illegal markets, with volunteer work, and many different other sources. It still is an index for the annual growth of a country. It's an attempt to define if a country is doing well, if the decisions they're making politically, socially, are improving, or we can take a look at a country's GDP, seeing it decrease, and look at the consequences of decisions and social standings and how they affect keyboards flying everywhere and how they affect the country. Is there anything else you would like to add, Chase? Do you find GDP is a good indicator? Do you think it is correct to value the currency of a country to make investor decisions based on the GDP index a country has? Is this the right way to look at economy?
Firstly, it's an inaccurate view because of all the limitations that aren't included in it, but it's also limited because if we got everyone in our country to go out and spend more money than they actually had tomorrow, taking out bank loans, spending all that money, it's going to cause our dollar value to actually be worth more because everyone has spent all this money. And so if that increases our GDP and then that increases our dollar value, couldn't we just go out and import everything we wanted from other countries for a lot cheaper because our dollar is worth so much more because we've artificially inflated our GDP? For example, if we go and cut down all the forests tomorrow in Canada, we're going to be increasing our GDP by a phenomenal amount. However, it's going to be only within that 1 year time period. It's not going to allow us to consistently keep that GDP. And so though we're bumping it artificially by destroying all of our forests, it's only for a very short period of time, and our actual gain isn't a gain.
That would be a large issue with how the GDP process works. Countries can make investment decisions based on the growth or the decrease of the GDP value. But when you look at how small businesses function, how trends or the development of new technology changes the style of business, GDP is a safe standard, but not a very accurate one. So much of GDP is reliant on your ability to invest and consume that if the trend of investment and the trend of consumption changes at all, GDP no longer accurately represents the growth of the country. This is what happens when you transfer from electronic sources to manufacturing sources. It's software to hardware development. Once you have this switch between a need for a specific resource to another or a need for a specific service to another, the model of investment changes, and the GDP model doesn't predict changes in investment or changes in consumption. It can only look at basic growth from the most narrow scale we have. it is even very difficult to properly calculate GDP. We use taxes as a model because whenever there's a transfer from one service to another, there's a tax based on it. So the tax record allows us to model the value of a GDP. But when you look at large companies and tax evasions, when you look at individuals who are not paying their taxes, or when you're looking at people that actually have a large amount of currency, but it is neither in the bank nor being invested, you create missing information. The goal of a GDP index is for both the consumer and the investor, for us to know what is going on. Unfortunately, this calculation is created with known errors and no ability to predict a trend. So GDP is not a very interesting subject in the sense that it just has its definition, and beyond the scope of that, it's just a question of, is this a good index to look at the trust in an economy? But it's still very important because so many decisions are based on that. The GDP is more important when we look into debt. I don't believe we'll be doing that for the next video. So I'm going to close it off. If you have any questions, comments, or criticisms, please send us a message. You can send us a tweet at cs.mad at capital M, capital A, capital D, Anomics. You can trend a conversation at MADenomics, and all the other information to message us will be found in the description below. Chase, sign us out.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.